The house had grown quieter with each passing year. No radio playing softly in the kitchen anymore, no footsteps crossing the hall, no laughter echoing through rooms that once overflowed with life. Now, only the clock remained faithful, ticking softly, a sound too small to fill the emptiness. She could hear everything, the rustle of curtains in the evening breeze, the faint hum of the refrigerator, even the creak of the wooden chair when she sat down, but none of it felt alive. Sometimes she caught herself whispering words out loud, just to prove she still had a voice. But her voice, too, seemed swallowed by the stillness, thin, fragile, barely her own. Her world had become soundless, not because her ears had failed, but because everything that once made noise had gone, and in that deep, quiet, loneliness grew roots. She didn't yet know that the silence she feared was not empty. It was waiting for a voice older than time, softer than breath, stronger than sorrow. She used to think silence was peaceful. Now she understood. Peace is full, but silence can be hollow. Each morning she woke to the same soundless air pressing down on her chest. It wasn't loud, but it had presence, like a fog that clung and wouldn't lift. She tried to fill it with little noises, the scraping of a chair, the kettle's hiss, the shuffle of slippers on the floor. But as soon as they stopped, the silence returned, heavier than before. Even her prayers had grown quieter. She found herself speaking less, listening more, though she heard nothing in return. There were moments she pressed her palms against her ears, as if the silence itself had a voice, whispering nothingness over and over. It wasn't peace. It was absence, or so she thought, because sometimes before heaven speaks, it empties everything else first. And that silence, unbearable as it seemed, was already holy ground. There was a time she used to talk to herself, to the walls, to the photographs, even to the teapot on the stove. It made the loneliness feel smaller. But lately, even that had stopped. Her words had dried up like a well untended. She would open her mouth to speak and then close it again, forgetting what she meant to say, not because she couldn't think, but because there didn't seem to be anyone left to hear. When she answered the occasional phone call, her voice startled her. It sounded older, thinner, distant, like it belonged to someone else. After the calls ended, she would sit in her chair and whisper softly, "Who am I talking to anymore, Lord?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Or so it seemed, because heaven was not ignoring her. It was listening too deeply to interrupt. Every night she still prayed, habit perhaps, or hope she couldn't quite let go of. She would fold her hands, bow her head, and speak into the silence. Sometimes long prayers, sometimes just a few words, sometimes tears alone. But lately, it felt as if her prayers never left the room. They hung in the air like smoke that refused to rise. She waited for an answer, a sign, a whisper, a feeling, anything, but nothing came. "Are you there?" she asked one night, her voice trembling. "I can't hear you anymore." The stillness remained. The candle beside her flickered once, then steadied, its small flame the only heartbeat in the quiet. She closed her eyes, defeated, not realizing that even her silence had become prayer, and that the one she longed to hear had never stopped listening. The silence wasn't always empty. Sometimes it filled itself with ghosts of sound, faint, tender, fleeting. She would hear them when she least expected it, the deep laugh of her husband echoing down the hall, the soft hum of her mother's hymn from long ago, the clatter of plates, and the murmurs of a family long scattered. It wasn't madness, it was memory, alive in its own way. And for a few seconds she would smile, but then it would fade, and the silence would rush back like a wave, heavier for having been interrupted. She longed not just for sound, but for presence. Voices she could touch, laughter she could join. Instead, she had echoes, kind but distant. One afternoon she whispered, "Lord, if I could just hear you once, for real, I'd be all right." She didn't know it yet, but that longing itself was already his answer beginning to form, because the first sign of divine response is always hunger for it. The old clock on the wall was her only constant companion. It had belonged to her parents, and its steady rhythm had once comforted her. Now it only reminded her how much time had passed, and how much of it remained. Tick, morning, tick, evening, tick. Another day survived. Sometimes she caught herself staring at it for minutes at a time, watching the pendulum swing back and forth like a slow heartbeat. It kept perfect time, even when everything else felt suspended. And somewhere deep down, she wondered if God's silence was like that, faithful, rhythmic, precise, but working in ways she couldn't yet hear. "Are you marking time too?" she whispered one night, "or have you stopped listening altogether?" The clock kept ticking, but in heaven, the answer had already begun. A reply not bound by seconds or hours, but by grace, unfolding quietly through her waiting. It was late. The house was dark except for the dim glow of her bedside lamp. She had prayed again, the same prayer she'd spoken for years. "Lord, speak to me, just once. Let me know you're still here." No answer came. Her voice trembled. "Maybe you've said all you needed to and I just didn't listen." A pause. Then softly, "If you won't answer, Lord, I'll stop asking." It wasn't anger. It was surrender. A tired soul finally laying down its questions at the feet of a silent God. She turned off the lamp and lay down, her hands still folded. And though the silence deepened, it was different now. Not cold, not cruel, but strangely still. Heaven didn't rush to break it. Because sometimes love waits until we are done speaking before it answers. And that night Jesus did not speak. He simply drew near, closer than her breath, nearer than her pulse, unseen, but unmistakably there. At first, nothing seemed different. The same walls, the same silence, the same clock ticking faithfully, but something inside her had shifted. It was as though the silence had changed texture, no longer heavy, but alive, almost breathing. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as if the quiet was holding her instead of haunting her. She began to notice things she hadn't before. The softness of light through the curtains, the rhythm of her own heartbeat, the warmth that lingered when she whispered his name. It wasn't an answer in words, it was presence, gentle, steady, patient. Sometimes she would stop what she was doing, close her eyes and whisper, "Is that you?" And though the air remained still, her soul would stir with warmth that had no earthly source. God had not ended the silence, he had entered it. And from within that stillness, the first true answer of her life began to form. One not heard by ears, but felt by heart. It happened one early morning. The world outside was pale with dawn, and the first bird had yet to sing. She sat at her small table, hands around a cup of tea gone cold, eyes distant, and then she felt it. Not a sound, not even a thought, but something deeper. A still, soft awareness that settled into her chest like a sigh of light. It wasn't her imagination. It was knowing. Pure, gentle, sacred knowing. Her tears came before she understood why. It wasn't sorrow this time, but recognition. Every quiet moment, every unanswered prayer, every long night of silence, all of it had been leading here. In that fragile instant, she realized she hadn't been abandoned. The silence had been his whisper all along. Not a word from Jesus, but Jesus himself had been the word within the quiet. From that day forward, the silence no longer frightened her. She welcomed it. She even began to look for it, because now she could feel it, the presence that lived inside the stillness. When she closed her eyes, the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It pulsed gently like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. A warmth began to fill her chest, spreading slowly to her hands, her shoulders, her very breath. It didn't make sense. She hadn't heard anything, and yet she understood he was there. There was no need for words, no miracles, no signs, no thunder, just a silent room made sacred by his nearness. She whispered, "So you were never gone." And though nothing moved, she felt the air tremble, as if heaven itself had smiled. One evening, she sat by her window watching the last light fade. The room grew dim, and the city sounds outside fell away one by one. Soon, Only the steady tick of the clock remained. She didn't pray, she didn't ask. She simply sat, still, quiet, open, and in that stillness, peace descended like soft rain. No sound, no vision, no sudden revelation, only awareness. Jesus was there. Not arriving, not leaving, there. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You didn't have to say a word." Because sometimes the truest answer isn't spoken, it's presence. It's the realization that God's silence is never absence. It's intimacy, too deep for language. Her soul rested that night, not because she had been answered, but because she had been found. In the days that followed, the silence began to speak, not in sound, but in memory. Scriptures she hadn't read in years began to echo softly in her heart. "Be still and know that I am God. I will never leave you nor forsake you. My sheep hear my voice." They didn't come from her mind. They rose from somewhere deeper. Each one arrived like a small candle being lit in a dark room. She would whisper them aloud, trembling slightly as she spoke. "Oh Lord, you did speak. I just wasn't quiet enough to hear." The tears that came this time were not of longing, but of gratitude, because she finally understood. Jesus had not been silent at all. He had been speaking through peace, through breath, through every heartbeat that carried her through the waiting. Her silence had been the classroom where he taught her to listen without sound. Her little home hadn't changed. The same faded curtains framed the window, the same photographs lined the shelf, the same old clock ticked softly on the wall. But something invisible had shifted. Every room seemed to carry warmth now, not physical warmth, but presence. Even the shadows in the corners felt softer, as if they no longer belonged to loneliness. When she sat in her chair by the window, she felt surrounded, as though the air itself held her gently. The quiet had become alive. Every breath she took seemed to whisper Emmanuel, God with you. Visitors who stopped by couldn't explain it. They would lower their voices without knowing why, saying later that her house felt different. It was, because once Jesus fills a silence, even ordinary rooms become sanctuaries. Her prayers had always been full of words, pleas for help, questions, memories. But now, when she knelt beside her bed, she didn't say anything. She simply closed her eyes, rested her hands on her lap, and breathed in the silence. It was not empty anymore. It was communion. The act of prayer became like sitting beside a dear friend who needed no conversation, just the comfort of being together. She found herself smiling sometimes, for no reason other than knowing he was near. And on days when sorrow returned, as it still did, she would whisper softly, Lord, I don't have the strength to speak today. And in the quiet that followed, she felt him answer not with sound, but with stillness that wrapped her like arms unseen. The silence had once been her fear. Now it was her prayer. Silence had become her companion. She no longer ran from it, no longer tried to fill it. Instead, she welcomed it like morning light through her curtains. It was alive, not with noise, but with nearness. When she walked through her home, every sound she once ignored became music. The kettle boiling, the pages of her Bible turning, the creak of the floor beneath her feet. They weren't reminders of emptiness anymore. They were rhythms of life, sanctified by presence. Sometimes she would stop in the middle of the room and close her eyes, feeling the stillness hum like a quiet song that only her heart could hear. This was her new way of hearing God, not through ears, but through the sacred stillness of trust. And in that peace, she found something greater than sound. She found communion. One afternoon, a woman from the church came to bring her groceries. As soon as she stepped through the doorway, she paused. There was something about the air, a calm, almost tangible quiet, like stepping into a soft light. The two women spoke little. They shared tea, a few smiles, some gentle laughter. But when the visitor left, she stood for a moment in the hallway, tears in her eyes. I don't know what it is, she whispered to herself, but her silence feels like peace. Word began to spread. Neighbors, friends, even the mailman noticed. Everyone who entered her home left calmer than they had arrived. She never tried to explain it. She simply smiled and said, I think Jesus likes to sit here with me. And he did. Every day, quietly, faithfully, filling her home, her silence, and her heart with himself. With time, her smile became her ministry. It wasn't forced or bright. It was calm, gentle, and full of something people couldn't quite name. When visitors came with troubles, they often began to talk quickly, their voices trembling. She would only listen, nodding softly, sometimes placing a wrinkled hand over theirs. No advice, no long sentences, just stillness. And somehow, by the end of the visit, the air would feel lighter. The heaviness people carried when they entered seemed to melt under her quiet gaze. They didn't understand it, but she did. It wasn't her doing. It was him. Jesus had filled her silence so completely that his peace now spoke through her without sound. One young neighbor once said through tears, "When I look into your eyes, I feel safe." She smiled gently and whispered, "That's because you're not seeing me, dear. You're seeing the one who never leaves." And indeed, the presence that had once come to comfort her now reached others through her, the silent vessel of his nearness. It was early, and the world was still asleep. The first light had just begun to color the sky, and the air carried that sacred hush before morning. She sat in her chair by the window, the same chair where she had prayed, wept, and finally learned to listen. Her Bible lay open on her lap, her glasses beside it. The clock ticked faithfully on the wall. She breathed in slowly, deeply, one last breath that felt more like peace than air. Her lips curved into a faint smile, and as the sun began to rise, her body rested still and serene. It wasn't death that came for her. It was fulfillment, the moment when silence gives way to song. The home remained quiet, but it was not emptiness that filled it now. It was presence, the lingering fragrance of heaven's peace. Light surrounded her. It was not blinding, but living, soft, endless, full of warmth. She stood, whole and radiant, her heart beating in rhythm with joy itself. There was no need to ask where she was. She knew, and then she heard it, not through ears but through every part of her being. A voice, the same one she had longed for, prayed for, waited for through years of silence. It said her name, once, gently. And at that sound, every moment of waiting, every unanswered prayer, every lonely night became sacred, the steps that had led her here. She fell to her knees, tears of glory in her eyes. "Jesus," she whispered, "you did answer." He smiled and reached out his hand. "Every time you sat in silence, I was speaking," he said. "You just hadn't learned my language yet." In that instant, all the years of quiet became clear. They hadn't been punishment, but preparation. Jesus drew her close, his eyes full of that same calm she had carried in her final days. "You thought I was far," he said softly, "but I was in every quiet hour, every steady heartbeat, every tear you cried into the stillness." She wept, not from sorrow, but from understanding. The silence that had once felt heavy had been his presence all along, a holy conversation too deep for sound. Then, still holding her hand, he whispered, "Now listen, my daughter. Can you hear it?" And she did. The sound of heaven. Endless praise, endless peace, endless love. The silence of earth had turned into the song of eternity.